Good morning, everyone. It is Thursday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, digital sports producer for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, back with my weekly Zeise is Right video with Paul Zeise of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, our sports columnist. Paul, how are you?
I'm doing wonderful. How are you doing today, Adam?
I'm doing good. There's a lot to talk about, Paul. Lots of sports topics to chop up and get through with you this week. We're going to do a little Steelers, a little Penguins, a little college basketball at the very least. So, Paul, the first question I have for you is it's about the comments Ben Roethlisberger made earlier this week to Mark Madden on 105.9 The X radio station. He did an interview, and basically Mark Madden asked, did you have any urge to come back? And Ben Roethlisberger's answer was that the 49ers called him amid all of their injuries to Trey Lance and Jimmy Garoppolo to possibly come in and lead that, loaded team to a Super Bowl. He ultimately declined, he said, because he couldn't see himself anywhere other than black and gold. Paul, do you believe him?
Oh, boy. Do I believe him? That's a different question that I thought you were going to ask me. Can I give you an answer with some caveats? Let me give you an answer with some caveats. Because the answer overall is I don't believe that whole scenario and story that he gave us. Clearly, there's a couple of things about Ben that we have learned over the course of 20 years. Number one, Ben always knows how to make sure Ben stays in the spotlight. Always does. Whenever, during even last season, with his podcast, he would always, about every 2 or 3 weeks, he'd make sure that he had a little zinger in there that he knew was going to go viral, right? So we would all be talking about Ben, even though the Steelers were playing and, their other quarterbacks were there. And we also know that he's very good at embellishing things. That's the second thing we know. And the third thing we know is he's always very good at putting a spin that makes him look in the best possible light in any situation. So all of those things added up, I'm going to say that I believe maybe the 49ers just called him to kick the tires, kick the tires, so to speak. I would be very, very, very shocked if there was anything more than that. In other words, they might have called him, gauged his interest, and, maybe he was kind of like, I don't know, let me think about it or whatever. But I have a hard time believing they got to a point where they were actually talking about, hey, we want to sign you. What do we have to do? But again, the fact that he adds or he throws in at the end of his thing, I couldn't see myself ever being in any other uniform but the black and gold. I mean, that to me doesn't pass the sniff test, if you know what I'm saying. So it's a long way of saying this is Ben. This is classic Ben. Throws it out there, right? Knows that for the 24 hours or 48-hour news cycle, we're all going to talk about it, right? And then he'll pull back and, but I don't believe, I just don't believe that there was that real interest that some people are trying to make it seem. And I also don't believe for 1 second that Ben's love of the Steelers is why he would decline. Because I got to be honest with you, if you listen to all of his comments since he's been let go, we've heard him, how many times, Adam, make it pretty clear it wasn't his choice. That the general manager, I wanted to play, but the general manager didn't want me. You know what I'm saying? That kind of thing. And it's interesting he goes after Colbert, who's no longer there, as opposed to Tomlin, who is there and who's very popular. Because you mean to tell me if Kevin Colbert said, no, we're not going to sign Ben, and Tomlin said, I want Ben for 1 more year, you mean to tell me that they wouldn't have Ben? Come on, man. So my point is, listen, Ben is the best thing for our business, Adam. He always has been. There was never anything better than Ben being on the Fan, the Fan, when he had his show for 2 years or 3 years or whatever it was, where every Tuesday you had to tune in at 11 o'clock because you knew between 11 and 11:25 when he was done, he was going to drop at least 1 or 2 bombs that were going to go viral, that were going to cause a stir. And then, of course, that people were going to have to wait all the way until maybe post-game even to to talk to Mike Tomlin about it or ask questions about it. And quite often Mike Tomlin was like, yeah, it's just Ben being Ben. But my point is, you know, or he would say stuff, and then the next day when the locker room was open, everyone would have to go in there and ask, you know, his teammates about stuff he said on the air. He's the best thing for our business. I was sad he retired, not because I particularly cared about, you know, who plays quarterback, but because he's perfect for our business. He really is. He's a high-profile player who is not afraid. You know, he's not a robot who is, you know, afraid to say things. He's a very petty person and a very passive-aggressive person, which leads to some very good quotes that you can get a lot out of. So I don't know if that answers your question, Adam, but at the end of the day, it really smells and comes to me as Ben being Ben.
I agree with you, Paul. I think the number one reason it probably didn't go down is can you imagine him running that offense in San Francisco? I mean, could you imagine that working? I can't, because I mean it was so run based, right?
Yeah.
We know how much he hates he'll say he likes to run the ball. He doesn't like to run the ball. He never liked to run the ball. I don't think he would have fit with them.
No, and you know what they do? They don't necessarily have a lot of quarterback run stuff, but they do require a mobile quarterback for a lot of what they do. And you're right. They got to the third. I could see it now. 2nd and goal at the 1, and him, you know, audibling out of handing the ball to Christian McCaffrey or whatever, and trying to throw it so it can add to his touchdown passes, which he did quite often, by the way. He did that quite often when he was with the Steelers. They'd get inside the 3 or 4, you know, get inside the 1 or the 2 or whatever. And he would audible to try and, you know, pad his touchdown stats. And, you know, a lot of quarterbacks do that. But again, here's the thing. There might be some people listening to this that think that I like hate Ben or I've got a problem with Ben. I'm telling you right now, I love Ben. The reason I love Ben is because he was the best thing that's ever happened for this business in terms of, you know, and nowadays with all of these people with their canned quotes and their, you know, PR people and, you know, their filters and their guards are always up and, you know, they give these ridiculously just mundane answers to the point where you're like, why are we wasting our time and energy? Why are we wasting it coming here to do these interviews when we get the same, you know, answers? You got a guy like Ben, man, you got to love that for this business because say whatever you want to say, but his content was always viral.
Yeah, and he knows it. And I think that's why he's doing a podcast. I think he was smart, Paul, to eschew the like trying to be an analyst and getting reined in and having to do 30-second sound bites. I think the format he's in with the football and podcast is perfect for him. I mean, every time we write about it, you know, people click on it. And you know, we don't want to get into the habit of just like ripping off everything he's doing every week, but there's lots of good stuff he gets out of that podcast.
Listen, he gets all kinds of good stuff. Like, you know, I mean, when he had Mike Tomlin on, you know, that might have been the first time, maybe since Ryan Clark did a pretty good interview. These might have been the only 2 times since Tomlin's taken over that I've seen him actually look human. And what I mean by that is, you know, generally he's very guarded and just wants to talk about ball. You know, he only wants to talk about football. This and that ball. You know, we're a football group. We're a football team. He doesn't, but Ben got him to actually sound human and talk about, you know, his favorite sport to watch is gymnastics and, you know, the fact that he loves watching those YouTube videos or whatever of A7 football, which is a bunch of guys playing without pads and how he would love to buy a franchise. And, you know, he talked about all kinds of stuff and we saw him tasting and drinking beers. So the thing about it is you're right. Every week when that podcast comes up, you know, there's going to be at least 1 or 2 nuggets that you put up there and people are going to respond to because he's Ben and he knows it. He's very good at it. Very good at it. And I'm surprised he doesn't have a sponsor for that yet. You know, that's probably by design because he can say whatever he wants to say and do whatever he wants to do as long as he doesn't have to be beholden to a sponsor. And, you know, they tried to get some beer sponsors, but the beer sponsors are like, well, if we're going to sponsor your show, you got to drink our beer. And they didn't want to do that. But to me, if I had a bunch of money and I was a business, I'd love to sponsor that show. Because it's growing every week and it's bad. I mean, the thing about it is when he talks, it moves the needle and probably will move the needle for a few more years.
I agree. Paul, some other Steelers topics I wanted to touch on with you. Landon Roberts, since the last time you and I spoke, has signed with the Steelers to play middle linebacker alongside Cole Holcomb, who we spent some time on last week. What do you think of this? And then the other move that was part of that is they cut Miles Jack. So what do you think of this total overhaul of the middle linebacking core? Is this the one that's going to work? Is it better? Is it worse? What's your read on where things are going here?
Correct me if I'm wrong, did Devin Bush sign with Seattle, or was it his interest with Seattle, or what? I forget.
No, he signed with Seattle too, so he's gone.
So here's the thing. You know what this tells me, Adam? Are you ready? It tells me that the Steelers coaches were lying to us all last year. That's what it tells me. That they were basically looking at all of us and saying, you idiots don't know anything about football if you don't think Devin Bush and Miles Jack and Robert Spillane and all these guys are getting it done. That's what it tells me, Adam. More than anything else, it tells me they lied to us all last year because the inside linebackers were exactly who we thought they were. And that's the proof is in the pudding. The proof is in the fact that they let Robert Spillane go and sign a guy who's got a very, very similar skill set to him, right? Maybe they saved a couple of bucks, but for the most part, right? Miles Jack, they brought him in. He's fitting in. He's doing this. He's doing that. And he's gone. And then, of course, Devin Bush, who, you guys are just, picking on him. And your guys are just, it's easy to point out one guy, but there's other guys and they're this, that. Guess what? We knew what we were looking at, and that was a middle linebacker group that couldn't get it done. They weren't good enough in pass coverage. They weren't good enough in run stoppage. So, the fact that they are basically overhauling the whole thing, I like that they went out and got 2 veterans, right? It wouldn't hurt me if they signed another one, although they have the young kid. What's his name? Robinson.
Mark Robinson.
Mark Robinson. They have him, who I think he's got promise. I think he can be a pretty good player. Listen, if they drafted with a first-round pick a middle linebacker, I wouldn't hate it. I really wouldn't, because I thought that was an area of their defense they need to get better. If you tell me their first 3 picks are middle linebacker, corner, and receiver, I'm good, because that's what I think that they should prioritize. And again, they've signed 2 of these guys, and they have Robinson. They've got 3 guys that you could say, well, it's not an area of need. It is. They still need probably one more to really have competition to make sure they get better there. So I like it from the standpoint of it sort of validates the fact that we're not all going crazy. And that, all of us watching football, even though we're ink-stained, wretches who are just hacks and don't know a thing about football, we were smart enough to look at the inside linebackers and say, they ain't good enough.
Well, it wasn't just us, Paul. I do the Pro Football Focus recaps every week, and I mean, they beat those guys up pretty bad. I will say they were better in 2022 than they were in 2021. 21, they were just dreadful. I think they got a little bit better, so I think there is something to be said for that. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you. They still weren't good enough, and we saw that at different points in time. Paul, the other big move that they made since we last spoke was the signing of Samalu to the offensive line. He looks. Want to talk about advanced stats? He looks pretty good. He looks like a real addition to this offensive line. What's your read on that and what it means for this unit going forward?
Well, I mean, he's another guard, right? I mean, he's an interior guy, right? So, what does that tell you about what they're thinking about Kevin Dotson, and or James Daniel? I mean, at the end, here's the thing, and they bring these guys in to compete. But they also probably bring these guys in because if Kevin Dotson does his annual, I get out of shape and I have injuries and this and that and everything, they can cut him and be okay. Couldn't cut him when you have basically your next guy is what the kid they drafted from Illinois. I can't Kendrick
Green.
Kendrick Green, right? Couldn't really cut your guards when your next guy up is Kendrick Green. Well, it's pretty clear Kendrick Green is probably not going to be a Steeler when the opening day roster, if not before then. But the other part of it is when you bring in 2 guards and you got Daniels and you've got Dotson still, you now have the ability and the flexibility. Kevin Dotson does the annual thing where he, is either lazy or doesn't look like he's in shape or, has some nagging injury that keeps him out for 3 or 4 weeks. They have the ability to move on from him. And I think James Daniel makes a pretty decent salary. They probably have the ability to move on from him if they need to as well, at a cheaper option. So, at the end of the day, they've given themselves flexibility. And that's the biggest thing is when you go in these free agent market and, there's that first wave of the first day or whatever, where all the big names come off the board. That usually doesn't interest me that much because the Steelers are almost never involved with any of those guys, right? What's interesting to me is the next 2, 3, 4 weeks when they make these additions, it really tells you what they're thinking about their roster. It also gives you an insight into what they think about their draft. Because I'd be very shocked now if they went offensive lineman in the draft, right? Because they've really done a good job of fortifying. They could still go corner because even though they picked up Patrick Peterson, they lost Cam Sutton. So, they could still go corner. They could still go inside linebacker as well. Even though, but it tells you that they know that they need to fortify the inside linebacker position. So the only thing that hasn't been a surprise for me, Adam, is that they haven't picked up a veteran receiver. That would be because you could still draft it. You never have enough receivers, but you could still draft a guy even if you signed a veteran guy that knows how to play, and you could because you have your top two guys. Johnson and
Pickens.
And you have those two guys. And, at the end of the day, you need probably two more. I don't know who I know everybody, Calvin Austin has become the new Senquez Golson. Remember that guy? They drafted him in the second round. I think it was from Notre Dame. He was a corner. Oh, boy. Wait till he gets healthy. And by the time, we got a year and a half into it, he went from being, a guy who maybe had some potential to, this guy's going to be the next Deion Sanders. And that's happening with Calvin Austin, too. But at the end of the day, you don't know exactly why. You don't know exactly, what he's going to be. So how can he be, someone you trust until you see him healthy and out there running around and all that other stuff. So, to me, the fact that they haven't signed a veteran receiver tells me there's a good chance receiver is an area they're going to probably go in the draft, which, since we like to, tie everything together, it is somewhat interesting that Omar Khan, Weidel, and Tomlin, none of them were at USC's Pro Day to watch Jordan Addison play. That's kind of an interesting little tidbit as well. Some people are reading it as, well, that means they're not going to go receiver. But the reality is it might be they just don't really have that much interest in Jordan Addison given where they're picking. I mean, that could be it too. Or it could be, hey, we watched this kid for 2 years. Why do we need to see him more? Or whatever. We watched this kid over in the South Side for 2 years. Why do I need to go see him more? We know what he can do. We know who he is. If we want him, we'll bring him. If we want to talk to him, we'll bring him into the facility. We can have him make him one of our visits. We'll interview him or whatever. But we know what he can do. You know what I mean?
Paul, what's your overall takeaway on how much is riding on the draft for the Steelers, going into next season? Is this did they do the things in free agency? There's people out there saying, they're contending with the AFC's best right now. I don't know if I believe that. I don't know if I believe that this is a, 11, 12, 13 win team. I'm kind of looking at it as more like maybe 11's the higher end. And I think they have to make some noise in the draft to get where I think people really want them to be.
Yeah, I do too, Adam. I think that they're a team that probably is very close to what they were last year. Everybody assumes that Kenny Pickett's going to make this huge monumental jump and that's going to change everything. And, I have to see it. I have to see it. I have to see it with the guy calling plays. I have to see it, with Najee Harris staying healthy, which, early on last year he wasn't healthy and it really hurt them because they lost some games because they couldn't run the ball. But I also think they need more high-end talent. I do. I think they probably need one more playmaker on offense. And they've got a lot of playmakers on defense, but the X factor there is, and I know people hate it when you say this, can TJ Watt play 15 games or more? And not just play 15 games or more, play healthy 15 games or more, because he played, I don't know what the number was this year, but first 3 or 4 weeks after he came back, he wasn't TJ Watt. It wasn't until the end of the year when he was back that all of a sudden now he's showing an impact, like, wow, that's the guy that, but the thing is, he's got to be able to stay healthy. And he's been a guy that is, very violent in the way that he plays. He's involved in a lot of collisions. He doesn't know how to, go half speed. And as a result, those are the kind of guys that their body gets beat up pretty quickly.
Paul, any final thoughts on Pitt and Penn State's basketball seasons coming to an end? Pitt against Xavier and Penn State against Texas in the round of 32. We spent a lot of time talking about how those matchups might play out, which one had a better chance to win. In the end, I don't know that either one of them had a great chance to win. I think Texas played the game against Penn State that Illinois should have tried to play 3 different times, and Penn State might not have been in the tournament at all. If they had done that, I thought Texas was disciplined, played a great game. Xavier shot the lights out of the gym in that game. It just seemed like, there was big steps forward this year, but you saw in those games how far both of these programs still have to go.
Well, the Penn State-Texas game, Texas has better players. That was very evident. But here's the other thing, and we talked about this with Penn State at the start of the tournament. They're going to live and die with threes, right? What's the white kid's name that hit 8 threes in the first game? What's his name?
Andrew Funk.
Yeah, Andrew Funk. Didn't do much against Texas, and it showed. I mean, if he hits 8 threes, they probably beat Texas, So they were very reliant on the 3 ball in a lot of ways. But on the other end of the floor, they had a hard time stopping Texas. I think Texas is really good. And so it was tough. No shame in losing that game. They played them hard. They played them tough. They didn't look out of place. Pitt, to me, you know what? They got some bracket luck to get to where they got to. I mean, I'd have to look at the field, but they might have played the 2 worst shooting teams in the whole entire field of 68, the first 2 rounds. And it was good for Pitt because they were able to win a couple of games and generate some excitement. And, it was good. I mean, they even though both of those games were awful, and both of those games were played at a snail's pace, and it was just like grinded out football kind of thing. At the end of the day, Pitt got the win twice, and so they lasted the whole entire weekend. But and I said this after they beat Iowa State, when they play Xavier on Sunday, guess what? They can't rely on the other team missing, 25 shots or whatever. I think Iowa State was 2 of 22 from the three-point line, and one of them was just real late. And oh, by the way, real late, one of the last shots of the game when they were already down 20 or whatever. So I mean, they were at 1 for 21. I said they're not. Xavier is not going to do that. But here's what you saw from Xavier: their ball movement in that game was unbelievable. Everyone talks about their shooting. The shooting was a product of the fact that they were getting wide open shots because their ball movement was really good. And I thought Pitt's offense at times in that game, there was too much ISO ball, too much holding the ball. One guy trying to go 1-on-3 or 1-on-4 or whatever. You know what I mean? It was a stark contrast. But at the end of the day, Pitt really acquitted itself well, had a great tournament, played well. Xavier's better. I mean, period. It's one of the few times in the tournament that I can remember with Pitt that it doesn't leave you with, well, they should have done more. If you think about most of Pitt's runs, you kind of felt like, they should have done more.
You felt like they were Iowa State and Mississippi State.
Yeah, exactly. And they didn't do more for that. See, I wouldn't count their last trip when they lost to Wisconsin because that team stunk. They shouldn't have even been in the tournament. So they lost to Wisconsin in one of the worst games. I think the Wisconsin loss, which, if I'm not mistaken, was 44-41 or something. It was 43-41 or something stupid like that. The Wisconsin loss was the equivalent of the Sun Bowl's 3-0 loss of the football team. But before that, I mean, the one year, okay, they lost to Florida, and Florida was a national championship contender. But, they were a 1 seed. They lose to Butler. I mean, the one year they lost to Pacific. I would even argue and I know they had Dwayne Wade, but the Marquette loss was a bad loss. The Kent State loss was a bad loss. What was the team that had the big goofy center? Bradley. That was a bad loss. I mean, you look so many times during the tournament, season, it left you with, boy, they should have done more. And the season ending was, it was almost like a real letdown or a disappointment. Like, man, I thought they were going to do more. I mean, even, getting to the Final Four when they lost to, Villanova, that was a game that was there to be won. But at least you can say at that point, well, they did get to the Elite Eight. But Pitt maximized what it was going to be this year, I think. And they lost to a team that was better, so you can't feel bad about what they did. And the same thing with Penn State. They lost to a better team.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good capstone on both of those teams. Paul, we got to look forward now. This evening, there's going to be Sweet 16 action, so we're going to be getting right back into the hoops here. Who do you like, having watched the first weekend of the tournament, that's changed your perceptions that you like now that you didn't like a week ago, or maybe that you didn't like or that you did like a week ago, maybe you don't like so much now?
Well, I think we should mention that it is we're taping this, and we don't have a Micah Shrewsbury answer, so that's why we're not talking about it. I think we should probably
we should say that.
It's probably a very important part of the Penn State discussion is whether or not he's going to be back next year. We don't know that, so we just sort of ignored it. But anyway, hopefully it'll happen. But I think we should at least point that out so people watching are like, who are these two jagoffs talking about Penn State? They're not even talking about the coach who may or may not be gone. We don't know what's happening with him, so there's no reason for us to talk about it. Now, on to the Sweet 16. I think the best team I've seen is still Alabama. I don't know about you, but that's the best team I've seen. They can play any way you want to play. And they can really, they can go. They guard. They can score at all levels. They're deep. I like that team. Alabama's really good. Team that is probably better than I thought they were is Houston. Now that I've gotten the chance to really watch them, and I like their chances as well. I think that's a really good basketball team. In fact, that's probably one of the best games of the Sweet 16, right? Houston plays Miami, I think, right? Or is that the game?
Yes.
Miami against Houston? Listen, Miami showed me something in their last game. They beat Indiana. We can say whatever we want to say about Indiana. Indiana at times this year was ranked in the top 5, and they've got some really good players and they've got talent and but what Miami showed in that game is that they're going to be a problem for Houston because they can score. We talk about it all the time. They can score. And Jim Larinaga is the king of this. He often says, listen, we don't run offense here. We play offense here, which means that's why those guys are just firing away and they're, coming down and they're trying to find the first shot, best shot. Let's go. So Houston is a great defensive team, but they're going to have their hands full with Miami. The other really good game is the two teams we just talked about. Xavier plays Texas, don't they? That's going to be an unbelievable game. I happen to think Texas has better players, so they probably will win. But if Xavier moves the ball like they did last week and they get open shots, they got a chance. The one thing I like about Xavier is their offense is really good. And so, even though they might have a hard time stopping Texas at times, they might be able to score with Texas. So, that whole little region there, that little pod or whatever we call that, with those 4 teams, I like all 4 of those teams. Alabama's pod, to me, I think it would be a huge upset if Alabama does not come out of that. And I think they're the best team, but I also think some of these other teams that are in the Sweet 16 don't really do a whole lot for me. They, kind of got through. I know, the one team I do like is Florida Atlantic. I had said before the tournament they were the one sort of mid-major that could give a 1 seed real problems, and they didn't even have to play the 1 seed, which helped them. But at the end of the day, they're an interesting bunch because they can shoot it and they can get up and down a lot. So I mean, Princeton is what they are. You certainly don't want to fall behind them. They're not going to waste possessions. They're not going to have empty possessions very often. They're not going to turn it over very much. They're not afraid to go up and down with you. They're not like the old school Princeton where they've got to grind it out. But they do what you have to do to protect the basketball. And so they don't have many bad empty possessions, which means if you fall behind them, that could be a problem. But, I still think the best teams are the ones. It's interesting. Most of the blue bloods are gone. Oh, I'll tell you the other game that is going to be really good. UCLA Gonzaga. That should be a really good game. I mean, those two teams, I think they'll go at it really. That I expect that to be a last possession kind of game. And either of those two teams could win the national championship too. I mean, of the teams left, who can win the national championship? Alabama. I think UCLA, Gonzaga both could. I think that Texas could, absolutely. Houston, I think, could. I don't know if Miami can win 3 more games, or 4 more games. But Miami could maybe beat Houston. But, there's some teams that are left. Oh, and then here's the other one we should talk about, Tennessee. What did you think about their win over Duke?
That was the one game of the weekend I didn't get to see, Paul.
Well, everybody was talking about the officiating afterwards. Because
I didn't get to see a whole lot of it, so I'm going to have to defer to you on that one.
Well, here's the thing about Tennessee. When Rick Barnes, correct me if I'm wrong, he went from Clemson, right? Wasn't he at Clemson? Then went.
I thought he was at Texas.
Clemson and then at Texas. I think he went Clemson, Texas, Tennessee. I think, but I'm pretty sure it was. You know what? Give me 1 second. I'll tell you. I'm pretty sure he was at Clemson because this is what I remember from Rick from when he was down there. He played against Duke, and when he played against Duke, his teams were always really physical, and that's the thing. That's the way his teams have always played. They've always played very, very physical in terms of really just sort of getting after it and doing the thing where they just want to try and make every game a fist fight, basically. So I'm pretty sure he was at Clemson for a short period. Yeah, he was at Clemson in the 90s. And I remember Coach K, and back then it would have been it wasn't Roy Williams. It might have been Doherty or whoever it was that was after Dean Smith, whining about how, he came into Clemson and, he turned them into a bunch of thugs and goons, and that's not how you play basketball. That's what I was flashing back to on Saturday when everyone was whining about the way Tennessee was playing against Duke. And here's the thing. Yes, the officiating absolutely played a role in what happened in that game, because they officiated, they let them play. Which, if you're a coach, right, you want one thing from your officials: just be consistent. If you're consistent and you're calling it tight, okay, we'll call it tight the whole way as long as you're consistent. And if you're going to let us play. Don't let us play for 35 minutes. In the last 5 minutes, all of a sudden you're going to call touch fouls. Well, they let them play. And so Duke, and this is where, that discussion about winning with freshmen versus winning with 24-year-olds comes into play. Duke has a bunch of young freshmen. They did not handle the physicality of that game very well. And when it became clear they weren't going to get calls from the officials, they just sort of backed down. And so Tennessee, probably more than any other team, it's going to have to be the way the game is officiated. And if the game is officiated, in a way where they're allowed to play, they could win the national title if they get 3 or 4 more officiating crews like they had last week. And again, I want to make it very clear. I'm not saying that the officials decided the game. What I'm saying is when you play, and listen, I've coached, even though it's, high school and AAU and this and that and everything, I've probably coached in my life, I don't know, 700, 800, 900 games probably in my life, all levels, from high school. I actually, a couple of college games, I played, coached AAU a lot, whatever. Youth basketball. I always ask for one thing as the coach: just be consistent. And if they're not calling it, I've had games where I've had to call a timeout, call my players over and say, hey, listen, you're either going to adjust and start playing physical and giving it back to them and not backing down, or you're going to get blown out of the gym because the referees aren't bailing you out in this game. And I'm okay with that. And I'm okay with, hey, you're all going to foul out because they're, if you keep using your hands and reaching because they're calling every touch foul. You got to adjust to it. Stop whining, stop complaining, stop, you know what I'm saying? And so that's your job as a coach. But again, it's harder to do that with a team like Duke, where you've got, I think 4 of their top 5 are freshmen, right? Or 4 of their top 6 are freshmen.
Something like that.
Yeah, they have 4 of their top 6 are freshmen and another kid's a sophomore. I mean, at the end of the day, you've got a bunch of young guys. You got 18, 19-year-olds that are still trying to figure it out. It's tougher to do, and that's why those freshman teams, those freshman-laden teams, that's why they never win anything. I mean, I guess Duke won one, you know what I mean? And, Kentucky won one, but they were actually a little older. They actually had some sophomores and juniors.
You got to have a mix, yeah.
You know what I mean? But for the most part, those one-and-done teams, they never won anything because you get into the NCAA tournament. You're playing the best teams. B, most of the teams that advance in the NCAA tournament are older, or the experienced teams. And C, the games are officiated. Each game is a little different. And so if you run into a team and an officiating crew that is going to let them play, and you play a physical team, if I got 23, 24-year-olds in a physical game and you got 18-year-olds, I don't care how many stars your guys have behind their names. I'm winning. You know what I'm saying? And your guys probably aren't going to ever adjust, and they're going to whine, and they're going to say, oh, this isn't how they did it, when I was in high school and dunking on everybody. This isn't what, you know what I'm saying? That's the process you have to go through in a college basketball. As a college basketball, football, or basketball player, you have to go through that process where you're young and you kind of learn. Because at the end of the day, the guys that are 23, 24 years old that have been in the weight room now for 4 or 5 years, been in the nutrition program, played, 20, 80, 90, 100 basketball games, guess what? They're battle tested and they understand it. And so that's I did want to talk about that. Sorry to go on, but I did want to talk about that Tennessee game because I think some people get the impression that if you say that the officiating made a difference, that you're saying it was unfair or that Duke got cheated or Duke got robbed. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying very simply, the game was officiated a certain way that favored Tennessee, and Duke never, ever adjusted to it. And that's on Duke.
Yeah, and you know what, Paul? I think a lot of those games were officiated similarly this weekend. I thought it was you didn't have a whole lot of different games with different refs making different calls. It seemed like things were pretty consistent across the board. That was just kind of my read on the situation. But Paul, I know you also wrote about Rick Pitino heading to St. John's from Iona. I know you have some thoughts there, so I'm just going to let you. I'm just going to let you roll on that one.
Well, here's what triggered all that. Okay, Will Wade, right, who was one of the FBI Adidas coaches or whatever the hell, that scandal we're going to call it. He got fired at LSU. Of course, it took them, a year to fire him or 2 years? I mean, they didn't want to fire him. So it took actually him having a bad season or a mediocre season, I think, before they fired him. And, it was pretty – but he got a job at McNeese State, which is obviously, not Power 5 or not Power Conference or whatever. It's obviously a place where they don't care. You know what I'm saying? They want to win. They know they're McNeese State. They bring in a guy like Will Wade. They're willing to be used like a prostitute. And 2 or 3 years later down the road, he'll go somewhere else and get a better job. They know that. But if it yields a couple of NCAA tournament berths, that's all they care about. And but again, he gets a job, and I'm reading all these people who spent weeks and months, celebrating college basketball, and they're writing about, how great the NCAA tournament is and all the teams and this and that and everything. But they're jammed up that Will Wade got a job. And I'm saying to myself, this is the problem. All of these people that act like they're the guardians of the game, they're just so disingenuous about these things. We've got an NCAA tournament with Sean Miller, right? Bill Self, Bruce Pearl, right? Rick Pitino was in there. I could go through. There's a whole list of these guys that got. I mean, Andy Enfield from USC. I think USC was in there in the field. I mean, and Oklahoma State wasn't in the field, but Brad Underwood, who was at Oklahoma State when the whole thing blew up, he's in the field with Illinois. And there's, St. John's, a Catholic university, signing up, and Iona's a Catholic university, but St. John's, prominent Catholic university, signs up with Rick Pitino, who had 10 years ago, 8 years ago, had a scandal with prostitutes and strippers and things like that at Louisville. So my point is, I'm saying, I'm so tired of, I'm supposed to be outraged by certain guys, but we're going to overlook other guys. I mean, look, I love Sean Miller. I love the family. John Miller is a friend. I love them. Okay. But his assistant coach had to plead guilty and went to jail or whatever, right? His long
Had to wear a wire, I think.
Whatever. And I'm supposed to believe that all of that happened and nobody above him, like he was just a rogue assistant. Same thing with Brad Underwood. His assistant, at Oklahoma State went to jail, I think. Book Richardson, Chuck Person. He didn't go to jail. He had 2 years but he was with Bruce Pearl. You mean tell me that Bruce Pearl had no idea what Chuck Person was doing, right? I mean, that's the thing that really triggered it to me, is I get so tired of the selective outrage that people.
Yeah, Paul, can I tell you what really jammed me up? It was especially with Pitino. For years, there were these national guys that just buried him and buried him and buried him for years and years and years on a national perspective of like, this is everything that's wrong with college sports. They get this, moral outrage going. And then the second he's been gone for like 2 or 3 years and has a chance to go back into a job that they care about, they're all of them are now saying, oh, isn't it great that he's back at a big school because he's slick in the press conferences. And if you're slick in the press conferences, that must mean you're a great guy, right, Paul?
Well, yeah. I'll give you another great example. There's a guy who's got maybe the best team in the field. Kelvin Sampson. Let's just review Kelvin Sampson. He's at Oklahoma, right? The NCAA is coming in on him. Everybody knows they're going on probation, for whatever violations there was, this and that and everything. As this is all happening, he interviews for a job in Indiana, gets the job in Indiana. Oklahoma goes on probation. He's at Indiana for 3 or 4 years, whatever it is, and the exact same scandal he brings to Indiana. He gets Indiana put on, NCAA sanctions, and he gets a show cause where for 4 years he's not even allowed to coach, and he has to go to the NBA. And now he's being celebrated as like this great coach. Oh, he's this greatest guy ever. He's an old school coach with values and all this other stuff. It's like we're all supposed to forget these things. But again, what bothers me, Adam, the most is the selective outrage that goes on. And it goes even beyond. John Calipari is another guy who was in the field who put two programs on probation, right? It's the selective outrage. And the other part of it is that Adidas scandal that FBI scandal, documented proof that the going rate for the top players is $100,000 to $150,000, right? In every one of those cases, right? Some of the 4-star guys were 50,000, given 50,000 to some street agent or whatever, that kind of thing. But 100 to 150,000 is what the going rate was. That's what all of those documents and everything else in that whole case, right? But I'm supposed to believe that the two biggest one and done factories, Kentucky and Duke, right, had none of this was going on at Kentucky and Duke, and all of those 5-star guys all just went to Kentucky and Duke because they wanted to wear blue, right? Come on, man. But that's the way that the sport is covered, right? That's just how the sport is covered. And, the NIL, if you remember the NIL, boy, the NCAA really came down hard to show that they're getting serious by trying to go after those two twins, the girls from Miami women's basketball team, the twins or whatever. That's the first NIL, enforcement that's gone on. Come on, man. Hey, notice they didn't go to Texas A&M football or USC football or some of these places that it's documented that they've completely used NIL as recruiting inducements. No, we're going to go after Miami women's basketball program because guess what? If we bring down Miami women's basketball program, nobody gives a damn. It doesn't change the profile of our NCAA tournament. It doesn't change the profile of our, but to me, it's be consistent. And my thing is, I don't blame St. John's. If I was St. John's, I'd hire Rick Pitino too, right? I'm just tired of the hypocrisy. I'm just tired of being told that, we're supposed to care about this or we're supposed to care about that, this, that, and everything, when it's pretty clear they don't care about it. Because if they did, all of those guys I just now reeled off, would not be coaching in the NCAA tournament, especially the guys who have dudes that are either, who have former assistants who are either still in jail or served their jail time or are on probation and had to pay a fine. I read a story, I think it was Chuck Person. Was it Chuck Person or Book Richardson? One of the two. They're trying to rehab their image so that they can get back into coaching, right? And he's coaching like youth basketball in New York City. I think it's Book Richardson. He's coaching youth basketball. I think one of those two, I forget. But he's coaching youth basketball in New York City. I'm thinking to myself, okay, let me see if I get this straight. The 4 guys that were your bosses are making millions, and they're coaching in the NCAA tournament. And you, in order to rehab your image, have to go coach in New York City youth leagues. I mean, what kind of sense does that make? To me, honestly, why hasn't Sean Miller hired Book Richardson back? Why? I mean, he was a loyal assistant for how many years, right? Why isn't Bruce Pearl bringing Chuck Person back? I mean, that would be the right thing to do. But again, I'm sure there's some, they've got the scarlet letter because those guys are assistant coaches. They're not really all that relevant. So the NCAA can flex their muscles and, and blackball teams and all that other stuff when it comes to the stuff like that, which is absurd. But to me, when I read all the outrage that, somebody hired Will Wade. Yeah, somebody hired Will Wade. And somebody hired Rick Pitino. And somebody hired Sean Miller. And Bill Self has never been in trouble, right? And Calvin Sampson, somebody hired him. And Calipari got the best job in the country, even after he put 2 teams on probation. So, yeah, somebody hired Will Wade because they want a good coach who's going to win, and they realize that nobody cares about all of this stuff.
Yeah, I agree, and it's a lot of. I agree with you. It's a lot of how the sport is covered as well that drives me nuts. Because it is.
They're all guardians of the game. That's the problem. They all love the game, and they're very protective of it, and they're very protective of their relationship with certain coaches and certain ADs, and that's why it's covered the way it is.
Yeah. So any quick thoughts on the Penguins, Paul? I think we spent a lot of time on hoops, didn't really get a chance to get to hockey, but man, they've been looking rough lately, particularly Brian Dumoulin, Jeff Carter, the same guys we talk about all the time. And Mike Sullivan seems upset that people are talking about the same old guys making the same old mistakes, but that's kind of where we are, isn't it?
Circle back to our discussion about the Steelers middle linebackers. I mean, you can tell us to your blue in the face that these guys are getting the job done, but we know what we're looking at. At the end of the day, we know what we're looking at. And it won't shock me in the offseason if there's some changes that are made that suggest that we did know what we were talking about or did know what we were looking at. It's not, and it's not just Jeff Carter and Dumoulin. I think he's at the end of his contract, though, right? So I think they can get out from underneath him. But Carter's got a couple more years, which is absurd. And then, of course, there's the Tristan Jarry question. For the last 2 years, I've said they needed to get better at goalie. And, of course, Mike Sullivan has insisted that Tristan Jarry and Casey DeSmith are good enough. Casey DeSmith, to me, is fine if he's your backup and only your backup. But, he's got a lot of grit to him, and he's a fighter, and, he can win some games for you. But I said Tristan Jarry is not reliable, and he's not consistent. And if you want to win, you've got to have a goalie that's both reliable and consistent. So hopefully this offseason, they move on from him and get a better goalie situation. But if they don't, it'll be the same old thing. I had a reader in my mailbag, interestingly enough, that asked, do the Penguins have an actual plan for the next 2 years that goes beyond just sort of the basically, barely above mediocrity that they've been? They're not a contender, but they're not terrible. They're good enough to be 7th or 8th, maybe next year they're 9th, but they're I don't know what you would classify those teams that are sort of at the end of the playoff and maybe just missed the playoffs. Is that
wild card teams? Wild card teams, Paul.
the two wild card teams, and say the 3 teams that finish right behind them. Those 5 teams. I mean, do we call them the mediocre teams or whatever they are? The teams that are. My point is, it's actually a really good question. What is the plan going forward? Like, to me, the 3 stars that you brought back, or the 2 stars you brought back, obviously, Malkin and Letang, and you have Crosby. They've shown this year they can still play at a pretty high level. They haven't been the problem. So to me, if you are really legitimately serious about trying to build a contender, you need to do it this offseason. You need to do everything you can do to get out from underneath some of these contracts you have. You know what I mean? Get rid of some of these dead weight bodies. Get rid of Tristan Jarry, right? Clean it to the point where you can build it to the point where you give a chance for those 3 guys maybe next year to drive a team that has a chance to win. Because this team right now, they're going to make the playoffs. They always seem to do that. But once they get to the playoffs, especially if they're in the 8th spot, are they beating Boston in a 7-game series? Come on.
I don't think so.
I mean, and it's tough. So they've got to decide, do they want to be a contender? And if they don't, then they might want to think about, talking to Malkin and Letang about, hey, you want to end your career in a place that can win, waive your no trade. We'll get you where you want to go. We'll get you, to a team that you can, play your last couple of years and win cups or have a chance to win cups because we're going to rebuild. I mean, that it's got to be one doesn't it? It has to be one conversation or the other in the offseason. It either has to be, all right, we're going to get rid of some of the dead weight we have. We're going to get rid of Tristan Jarry. We're going to move on from some of these bad contracts. We're going to rebuild and try and put together a roster that has a chance to win, to get, to be a contender. Or we just don't think that's realistic. So we're going to call Chris Letang. We're going to call Malkin in. And we're going to say, listen, we know we have no trade clause, but you guys are signed at a really good number and can be a pretty good asset in terms of bringing back draft capital or prospects or whatever. And we want to rebuild. In other words, if you want to stay here, I guess, you can stay here, but you're going to be playing in a team that's not very good. So our thing is, if you want to end your career, here's why they won't do that, though, because then they would have to have that same conversation with Crosby. And Crosby might say, oh, you know what, I'll help a new team get, a new bunch of guys, but you got to do one or the other. Because if it's just another, sort of window dressing type off season, what have you accomplished other than to make sure that next year you go from having games where would they have like 12,000 in the building the other night to some games where you're going to have 7,000 or 8,000 if you continue down this path?
Yeah, Paul, I think there's a lot of conversations that have to happen. I'll be curious to see if they do, because at least publicly there's a lot of posturing of, and I think it's a lot of like what you say when it gets to the offseason, maybe some of the BS fades away and you see, the executives start to do the right thing. But for now, they are putting a pretty stubborn face on what's going on. But Paul, I think that's a great place to leave it for today. We got to a lot of topics, so hope everyone enjoyed it. Paul and I will be back next week. Make sure you're signed up, subscribe to the YouTube channel so you can get all of what we're doing here on the Post-Gazette Sports YouTube channel. Christopher Carter on the North Shore Drive on Friday. We'll have plenty more football talk, plenty, I'm sure, of basketball talk. So make sure you're signed up for that. Otherwise, we'll talk to you next week.
All right, we'll see you.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you liked the video, please like it and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you enjoyed it on Apple Podcasts, please rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. For 6 months of digital access to post-gazette.com for just $6, click the link down in the description.